Sharing screen. And at some point, I'm gonna use a Jamboard, and so I'll have once I open it, I think you guys will be automatically able to join it, and then I can do something like essentially drawing on the board without being in the same place. Okay, so chapter 4, which we'll get to part of today, and I'm not planning on going the full time. Chapter 4 deals some extensions of what Mendel looked at, but mainly related to traits that are linked to the sex chromosomes. And they follow the same principles, like they follow the same principle of segregation and principle of assortment, of independent assortment. But we see differences because having two X chromosomes makes you genetically female and an X and a Y genotypically male. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about sex determination. And in organisms that are diploid, and so which are most organisms that are diploid reproduce sexually. There is some asexual reproduction, so they would reproduce by like budding and simply going through mitosis. But we alternate between a haploid and a diploid state, right? So our gametes are haploid, and then fertilization gives rise to the zygote, which is the early embryo. And then once that becomes an adult, meiosis is used to produce haploid gametes, and fertilization, and this continues to cycle. Sex in general is one of the areas in biology where there is more variation than anything else. There's a really interesting book by an author named Matt Ridley called The Red Queen, which talks about differences in sexual dimorphism and like ways that animals attract mates and things like that. Really fascinating. But we sort of get in our mind that, X's are females and XYs are males. And that, we know that that's even more complicated in humans, but not all organisms do it the same way. Or it's not all organisms is are females genotypically XX and males genotypically XY. So there's some insects that are use an XXXO system. And so the females have two X's and the males have one X. So this O represents the fact that a second X is missing. So two X's corresponds to female genotype or female phenotype, and one X corresponds to a male phenotype. Some birds, or most birds maybe, reptiles, butterflies, some amphibians, some fish, use what's called a ZZ-ZW system. And the males have two of the same sex chromosome, which is called the Z chromosome. And females have two different chromosomes. And so you'll see these terms. I type in the chat. I can do this correctly. So the female in humans, or in most mammals, is homogametic, meaning it has two of the same sex chromosome, and males are heterogametic. They have two different sex chromosomes, the X and the Y. And the ZZ-ZW system, it's different. So males are homogametic and females are heterogametic. And they use Z and W as letters instead of X and Y, mainly because if they used X and Y, it would be confusing. Like we would think, oh, why is XX male in these birds? So they just use the different letters to keep it simple. You can see there's a lot of variation in insects because we've already looked at one example where there's an XO system for grasshoppers. Butterflies have the ZZZW system. And then Drosophila, which are the ones that we're using in our simulation, have a balance system, and it's the ratio of autosomes to X's. Okay. So with females, happen to have two X chromosomes. Males have an X and a Y, but it's the ratio of the X's to the autosomes. So females have twice as many X's compared to the autosomes as males do. They found if you get rid of the other sex chromosome, it doesn't make a difference. So in our XY system, the Y is what contributes the gene products found on the Y chromosome or expressed from the Y chromosome are what contribute to a lot of the male phenotypes. And in flies, it's this ratio. So a lot of differences. And we're going to focus on XXXY. And this is what I just said. So the Y chromosome is not actually Y-shaped, right? It has two short arms. Well, when it's doubled, it has two short arms and two long arms. There's our centromere. This blue band here contains the SRY gene. And SRY stands for sex determining region Y of the Y chromosome. When we talked about the autosomes, I mentioned that, if you look at chromosome 1 from one human and chromosome 1 from another human, the genes are going to be in the same location, right? And that's part of what being homologous means, that they have the same genes, but they might have different alleles. And I believe I talked a little bit about banding patterns. And so when you look at the bands, when you stain them, the banding pattern is going to be similar between the two. Now, it makes sense. If we have two X chromosomes, they're going to be homologous, right? When you have an X and a Y chromosome, they don't look very much the same at all. But the ends of these short arms and the ends of the Y chromosomes are regions of the Y chromosome that have homology to the ends of the arms of the X chromosome. And so, type in the chat again. So the ends of the Y chromosome are what's known as pseudo-homologous to the ends of the X chromosome. And it's because of there's just these regions of similarity. They're not homologous along the entire thing, but just at the ends. And that's what allows them to pair up during meiosis in males. So here's showing this. This is showing the similarities between what's happening in the X's and what's happening in the Y's. Okay, so now we're going to get into sex linkage. Before that, I want you guys to think about what's happening with the X and the Y chromosome during meiosis, right? A female who has two X's, half the gametes would get one of the X's, half the gametes would get the other X. For the males, half the gametes would get an X, half the gametes would get a Y. So what's important here, well, I guess I could ask you guys, maybe you'll be willing to type into the chat. What are some things, some patterns that we see? I guess I'll ask you a direct question. Can a son get an X chromosome from their father? Type that in the chat too. Yeah, right. So because these are sons, right, genotypically males, they're getting the Y chromosome from dad. Now, there's a possibility that they could get an X chromosome from dad, but that's if something goes wrong in meiosis, something called non-disjunction, where the sperm ends up with an X and a Y instead of an X or a Y, right? So if there's failure to separate in meiosis 1, you can get an X chromosome, and that's leads to something called Klinefelter, which we'll talk about later. So when we have females and males producing offspring, we expect a 50-50 ratio of females to males produced amongst the offspring. When we're doing crosses with traits that are on the X chromosome or on the Y chromosome, we see certain patterns because of the way that the sex chromosomes are passed on, right? Because of the genotypes that are produced. So when we have genes on the sex chromosomes, we talk about sex linkage. Generally, when people are talking about sex linkage, they are referring to X linkage. But I feel like it's better to be specific and say X linkage rather than sex linkage, because you can also have genes that are Y linked, and the Y chromosome is also a sex chromosome. So there's not as many Y-linked traits, and that's because the Y chromosome is small and doesn't have a lot of genes. But what you see with this is that if there's a Y-linked characteristic, sons will always inherit that from their father, right? All of his sons are going to get that Y-linked trait because he's only got Y chromosome, and he passes it on to all his sons. He cannot pass that Y-linked trait to any of his daughters because they don't get the Y chromosome. And so that's what I mean when I say having genes on the sex chromosomes means we see different patterns that are sex specific. The X-linked genes, and there's lots of examples of X-linked genes. What's unique about these is that females have 2 X chromosomes, males only have 1. So if we have a gene that is a recessive trait, a female needs to have both her X chromosomes with that recessive allele in order to have the trait. A male only needs 1, right? Because he's only got 1 X chromosome. And so we can't say that the male is heterozygous or homozygous for that allele, because hetero means different and homo means same, And if we're talking about things being different or same, we're talking about more than one. And there's only one. So we use the term hemizygous. And what you'll see with traits that are X-linked is that they tend to show up more in males than in females. And that's because the odds are that it's more likely the male is going to get one allele than a female getting two, right? Whatever the probability of a male getting one, a female getting two is, multiplying that probability. So greater chances of male getting the X-linked trait because they only need one copy of that allele. So, and this is kind of showing the same idea. So if we're looking at an X-linked trait, and when we're doing a sex linkage, we always draw the chromosomes. So you guys are used to me drawing Punnett squares with like big B, little b, whatever it is. But if I don't draw in the X chromosomes, then I'm missing half of the information, right? I need to write down X chromosome so that I know that this is a sex-linked trait. So if the female has two copies of this dominant allele and the male has one copy of the recessive allele, all of these offspring are going to have the normal phenotype, right? But if it was reversed and the female had one of these little b's, we would see this allele, this phenotype showing up in the offspring. So, like I said before, males cannot pass X-linked traits onto their son. They're only ever going to get an X-linked allele from the egg. Okay, so what does this mean when we look at inheritance? I talked to you guys a little bit last week about fruit flies and how Thomas Hunt Morgan was bound and determined to use them as a genetic model organism, but they all look the same. So I spent years mutating them, shooting them with little x-rays, shooting with normal size x-rays, and finally got a white-eyed female. And turns out that the allele, the eye color gene, which there's multiple genes that code for that express eye color, this particular one is on the X chromosome. And when he looked at patterns of inheritance, he saw something really unusual. So I'm going to talk about reciprocal crosses, because reciprocal crosses are really important in figuring out if something is a sex-linked trait. Because if something is an autosomal trait, it does not matter which parent the recessive allele comes from. If it's sex-linked trait, it very much does. Right? So if we have a red-eyed female, and she's homozygous for that red-eyed allele, remember that we refer to the pluses as the dominant allele, and without the plus is the negative allele. So X plus refers to being homozygous for the dominant allele. All of her gametes are going to have the wild-type allele. This white-eyed male, because we know it's on the X chromosome, half of his gametes are going to have the white-eyed allele on the X, and the other half will have the Y. But if the female is homozygous for the white-eyed allele, now all her gametes would have the white-eyed allele, and the red-eyed male, half of them would have the wild-type X, and half would have Y. So a reciprocal cross is when you swap the phenotypes of the parents. So here we have red-eyed female crossed with a white-eyed male. And here we have a white-eyed female crossed with a red-eyed male. And look at what happens in the offspring. So when these fertilize, we're going to end up with all of the flies being red-eyed, right? This X can be fertilized by this X from the sperm, and you get a heterozygous fly, but there's a dominant allele, so they have red eyes. Or this X with a wild type allele can be fertilized by the sperm with a Y, and you get all red-eyed males, right? So red-eyed females, red-eyed males. But if we swap it, and now our female is white-eyed and the male is red-eyed, well, this the egg with the white-eyed allele can be fertilized by the red-eyed allele, and we get all our females are heterozygous and red-eyed. But this X with the white-eyed allele, when that gets fertilized by the Y, all the males, excuse me, are white-eyed. So when we do this reciprocal cross, and we have a red-eyed female crossed with a white-eyed male versus a white-eyed female crossed with a red-eyed male, the outcomes are different, right? In one situation, we get all red, and in one situation, we get red and white. And what's particularly interesting about this is that all the red-eyed flies are female, and all the white-eyed flies are male. So not only do we have red and white, but they're sex-specific. And when you guys, not obviously on Monday since we're doing the test, but the next Monday when we do this with our simulated flies, you'll get outcomes. You might remember that this last time I didn't have you keep track of how many of each phenotype were male and how many of each phenotype were female. Next time I'm going to have you do that. And what you'll see is sometimes when you set up a cross, you get all of a phenotype being male and all of a different phenotype being female. And that might be an indication that it's a sex-linked trait. So when we take these flies and we look at the F2, right, if we take these red-eyed females and red-eyed males, look at what's happening in meiosis, right? Half the gametes have the wild type allele, half of white, half of wild type, half of Y. Well, now we see half of the offspring are red-eyed female, a quarter are red-eyed males, and a quarter are white-eyed males. If we look at the F1 from this next cross, take this red-eyed female and white-eyed male, then we see 50% of the offspring are red-eyed and 50% of the offspring are white-eyed. So we have a quarter that are red-eyed females, a quarter that are white-eyed females, a quarter that are red-eyed males, and a quarter that are white-eyed males. So the results of this reciprocal cross are consistent with X-linked inheritance. All right, and I want to make one point now. I'm going to type this in the chat. What I want, let's see. I'm going to let's talk about, I want you guys to see that it's important to look at what the question is asking. So if I asked you, what fraction of the offspring are white-eyed? Well, you would probably tell me. It's important to not make typos when you're trying to make a point. Right? So a quarter of all the offspring are white-eyed. If I ask you, what fraction of the offspring, of the male offspring, are white-eyed? It's 1/2 of the males are white-eyed. So make sure you pay attention to the question. Because if I'm asking what percentage of the offspring are white-eyed, and you say half are white-eyed, and you mean half of the males are white-eyed, but you don't tell me half of the males are white-eyed, you just answer half, I assume that you think half of all the offspring are white-eyed, right? So it does make a difference as to what the question's asking. So be careful. Hint, hint. Okay. So now what I want to do for this last slide, this is where we're going to end. I'm going to start. It used to be called a Jamboard. Now it's called a whiteboard. And I'm going to share it with all you guys. You should be able to hop in. And at the end of this, this Jamboard you guys should all be able to go back and look at it. I think somehow through the magic of Google. Okay. So these are some questions just to get you thinking about really inheritance patterns with the sex chromosomes. And I'm going to do, a couple of you have seen how badly I draw with this already this week when we met. But the way that I would approach this is by going backwards, right? So if we know this X chromosome right? So this, sorry, the Y chromosome, and I'm drawing it as a Y just to make it.
Could you resend the Jamboard? I was on my.
Should be.
I was on my phone.
You guys say how you found it.
It is gone in the chat because I was on my phone originally, but I don't have the Jamboard app, and so it's all the chat has deleted.
Let's see. If I can try here, I'll put the link in the chat, and that way I don't know how to. Oh, it is already in the chat. Okay. But here it is again.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, now I need to find it again. Now I have 2 copies of it. Yep. Okay. I have up here is nonsensical given where I stopped. I was trying to copy it. Right, so this X chromosome from this male came from the maternal egg, and this Y chromosome came from the paternal sperm. So is there a way? I mean, I guess we're going to assume that there aren't any mistakes in meiosis. Could the male get this X chromosome from his paternal grandfather? Right, so we know that this Y, if this is dad, that one of these came here, and this Y came here. And if this is the father, the paternal grandfather, would also have to have passed on that Y. So male cannot get his X chromosome from his paternal grandfather, right? The X chromosome is always going to come from the maternal side. Oops. Does that make sense? Does anybody question that logic or want me to go through it? All right. So I'm going to go on to the second one then, which is on the next Jamboard. Could a male have the same X chromosome as his maternal grandfather? You guys are going to have to excuse my chromosomes. And for this one, I'm only going to focus on the maternal side. Right, so from his mother, he got one of these X chromosomes, right? When we look at her father, which is the maternal grandfather, one of these X's is one of the mother's X's. So yes, right? The male could have the same X chromosome as his maternal grandfather. And if I go back to the first one, I'll right now want to. I'm going to let you guys answer the next one. And what I want you guys to do, you can work through that on a piece of paper or think it out in your head. Although I like to draw things out because it helps me keep track of what I'm doing. And choose a little sticky note from the side and tell me what you think. So once you've worked through it, you can use one of these sticky notes here or create a sticky note on the side panel and write a yes or a no. I guess if you guys want to put in your vote by putting a check mark on some of these ones that already exist, you can do that. It might be easier than whatever you want to do. I'll erase my vote. Some of you guys might be on phones and this might not be as easy, but it looks like like 6 of you, so more than half of you had said yes, and that's the right answer, right? So we know that we looking at the X chromosomes the same way, that a female could get the same X as her maternal grandmother. And for the last one, can a female have the same X as her maternal great-great-grandmother? Yes. Right. So we have to think about whether an X chromosome, males are never going to get an X from their father, right? And that's one of the differences that we see with why the answer to A is no, and the answer to B, C, and D is yes. All right. So do this last. I'll do this on the Jamboard too. I'll walk through this with you, and that way you'll have an example of how of looking at one of these crosses. And then this will be what I end with. And after this, I'll stop the recording. So in humans, hemophilia is an X-linked recessive trait. A female who's a carrier for hemophilia marries a male with normal blood clotting. So I'm on Jamboard, the 4th Jamboard. So when I say she's a carrier, what that means is that she's heterozygous, because this is a recessive trait. If she has the recessive allele, but also a dominant allele, she's not going to show that trait. She has offspring with a male who has normal blood clotting, so we automatically know his genotype. And then we want to set up our Punnett square. I'm slower with this than I am with a real whiteboard. So you see how when I'm setting this up, half the gametes from the female have big H, half have little h. From the male, half have big H, half have Y. And so if I look at so the first question is, what fraction of the female children will have hemophilia? Okay. And this is where I want to be careful, because the question says, what fraction of the female children will have hemophilia? So if I look at my female children, they're all normal, right? So 0 of the female children. If it's the next question, well, if I'm looking at female children, half are carriers, half are not. So if the question is, what fraction of the male children will have normal clotting? Well, the ones that have the dominant allele, right? And then the next question, what fraction of the male children will have hemophilia? Well, still 1/2. And then the last part, what if a man with the disease marries one of the carrier daughters from the F1 generation above? So I'm going to go to the next slide. Well, that is a big box. Okay. So if we have a carrier female who mates with a male with hemophilia, then we see hemophilia showing up amongst the daughters. So it's not that females can't get X-linked traits. It's just less likely because they need to get that X chromosome from both parents. Okay. So that's as far as I wanted to get today. I'm going to stop recording, and then I'm going to have to remember how to. It's been a while since I've had to upload a video to YouTube, but I will get that done. Do you guys have any questions?